¿Ya conoces las publicaciones del Centro Olof Palme? Te invitamos a conocer México y las operaciones de mantenimiento de la paz de las Naciones Unidas en el siglo XXI, retos y oportunidades. Bajo la autoría de 13 expertos, coordinados por María Cristina Rosas. En esta obra aprenderás qué es el mantenimiento de la paz, la experiencia de Canadá, Turquía y China en el mantenimiento de la paz, qué son las operaciones de mantenimiento de la paz conjuntas, así como la relación entre las operaciones de mantenimiento de la paz y la delincuencia, la policía y el género, entre muchos temas más. Adquiere ya, México y las operaciones de mantenimiento de la paz de las Naciones Unidas en el siglo XXI, retos y oportunidades. Envíanos un mensaje a través de nuestras redes sociales para adquirir esta, y otras obras del Centro Olof Palme México. Contáctanos hoy mismo.
Good afternoon, Mexico. Good morning, Melbourne, Australia. It's really a pleasure to welcome you all to another session of An Afternoon With. In this opportunity, we will be interviewing a very well-known scholar, policymaker, and professor, Gareth Evans. I will make an introduction about him in a few minutes, but I would like also to welcome you all here in Zoom and also in Facebook Live, and remind you that we will be waiting for your questions. You can place them here or in Facebook Live for our guest. Our guest, Gareth Evans, who we are very happy to have with us today. Welcome. I would like to say a few words about his resume that is very impressive, and believe me when I tell you it may take us several weeks to talk about his personal achievements and his personal and professional experience in a number of fields, but I'll make an effort to say some of his multiple achievements for the purpose of this introduction. The Honorable Gareth Evans is distinguished honorary professor at the Australian National University, where he was Chancellor from 2010 to 2019. From 2000 to 2009, he was President and Chief Executive Officer and is now President Emeritus of the Brussels-based International Crisis Group, the Independent Global Conflict Prevention and Resolution Organization. From 1983 to 1996, he was a cabinet minister in the Hawke and Keating Labour governments for 13 years in the posts of Attorney General, Minister for Resources and Energy, Minister for Transport and Communications, and Foreign Minister. A member of the Australian Parliament for 21 years, he was Senator for Victoria from 78 to 96, serving as deputy leader and then leader of the government, and was a member of the House of Representatives from 96 until September 99, serving as deputy leader of the opposition. As one of Australia's longest serving foreign ministers, he was best known internationally for his roles in developing the UN Peace Plan for Cambodia, bringing to a conclusion the International Chemical Weapons Convention, founding the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation APEC Forum, an Asian Regional Forum, and initiating the Canberra Commission on the Elimination of Nuclear Weapons. In 2000-2001, he was co-chair with Mohamed Sanoun of the International Commission on Intervention and State Sovereignty, appointed by the Government of Canada, which published its groundbreaking report, The Responsibility to Protect, R2P, in December 2001. From 2008 to 2010, He co-chaired with former Japanese Foreign Minister Yoriko Kawaguchi the Australia and Japan-sponsored International Commission on Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament. Its report, Eliminating Nuclear Threats, a Practical Agenda for Global Policymakers, was published in December 2009. His other international policy-making roles have included membership of the UN Secretary-General's Advisory Committee on Genocide, of the UN Secretary-General's High-Level Panel on Threats, Challenges and Change, whose report, A More Secure World, Our Shared Responsibility, was published in December 2004. The Commission on Weapons of Mass Destruction, sponsored by Sweden and chaired by Hans Blix, which reported in June 2006. The International Task Force on Global Public Goods, sponsored by Sweden and France and chaired by the former President of Mexico, Ernesto Zedillo, which reported in September 2006, and the Commission of Eminent Persons on the Role of the International Atomic Energy Agency to 2020 and beyond, whose report, Reinforcing the Global Nuclear Order for Peace and Prosperity, was launched in June 2008. He had previously served as a member of the Carnegie Commission on Preventing Deadly Conflict, co-chaired by Cyrus Vance and David Hamburg. From 2011 to 2015, he was chair of the International Advisory Board of the Canberra-based Centre for Nuclear Non-Proliferation Disarmament. Gareth Evans is currently co-chair of the International Advisory Board of the Global Center for the Responsibility to Protect and is chair of the Asia-Pacific Leadership Network for Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament and the Advisory Board of the Australian National University Centre for Asian Australian Leadership. Among other current positions, he's a member of the board of sponsors of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, the Global Leadership Foundation, chaired by the former president of South Africa, F.W. de Klerk, the Aspen Atlantic Group, chaired by Madeleine Albright, the Supervisory Council of the International Luxembourg Forum on Preventing Nuclear Catastrophe, etc. And yes, I'm going to stop in a minute just to mention a couple of his publications. Gareth Evans has written or edited 13 books, including Cooperation for Peace, The Global Agenda for the 90s, Australia's Foreign Relations, a book I encourage you to read if you are interested in Australian foreign policy. That was the first book I read on Australian foreign policy when I was developing a research on the issue. He wrote this book with Bruce Grant, and he has also written a book called A Responsibility to Protect, Ending Mass Atrocity Crimes, Once and for All, and his memoir, which is called Incorrigible Optimistic. I love this title, that was published in 2017. So, as you can see, and I warned you, we can take several sessions to go into the details of Mr. Gareth Evans' resume, but I believe we all want to listen to his views, his analysis on a number of issues of concern in today's world. So, first of all, Professor Gareth Evans, welcome. Thank you again for joining us and for accepting this interview.
Well, thanks so much, María Cristina, for that very generous introduction, which makes me feel very old, I have to say, when I listen to all of that. But, thanks so much. It's a great privilege to join you today. And it's a great privilege in particular to be associated in this way with the Olof Palme Center, because Olof Palme was always one of my great intellectual and foreign policy heroes with his concept of common security. Let me also say that issue my condolences, if I may, for the great tragedy that you had in Mexico City yesterday, which is in our newspapers in Australia and indeed all around the world. It's a terrible tragedy, and our heart goes out to you. But I am very happy to join you and your friends today, so let's get into it.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the condolences. We are very sad for what happened yesterday night, and we hope this never happens again, but of course, we need clarification and investigation and, you know, all that process that must go on. So about our interview, you described yourself, according to your memoir, as an incorrigible optimistic. And I think that's fantastic because, well, we are living in difficult times. We have the pandemic, you know, and that calls for pessimism. And we also are facing a number of challenges in the international agenda. For instance, last January, as we all know, the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons came into force. That's a fantastic news. But we also have bad news when it comes to the fact that Prime Minister Boris Johnson announced recently an increase in the nuclear weapons stock of Britain. So I would like to have your views on the international environment, on the international agenda, and the main challenges that we are facing these days, apart from the pandemic, of course.
Well, I describe myself as an incorrigible optimist, I guess, for two reasons. One, because if you can stand back a little from the current events and the many traumatic events and uncertain and volatile events that are around us, which we'll come to, I think, and look at the broad sweep of history, there is ground for optimism that we're making progress, that we have learnt a lot about the horror and misery of war, and are pretty reluctant as a set of sovereign nations to plunge into war, because with modern technology, even putting nuclear weapons aside, the scale of the devastation really makes any cost-benefit calculation come down very much on the side of the costs. And people like Steven Pinker, who've written a lot about the decline of violence over the course of centuries, sometimes dismissed as a naive optimist for that view, I do think get it basically right. I think the second reason I'm an incorrigible optimist is simply because you have to be. I think to get out of bed in the morning, you have to believe the change is possible. You have to believe that a safer and saner world is possible if you're going to make it so. Optimism is self-reinforcing in the way that pessimism is very self-defeating. So that's my starting point. But looking out at the world around us at the moment, not only do we have these big three existential threats to life on this planet as we know it, namely climate change, possibility of nuclear weapons catastrophe, and also now, as we're acutely aware, pandemics. There are many, many parts of the world in which conflict is still going on, and there's many instances of our failure to effectively stop serious mass atrocity crimes, sometimes genocide even, with Syria the most obvious example, but Myanmar a very current one. We do see an inability to deal with some of the most serious assaults on human rights in countries like China with the Uyghur population and so on. So there's much to be miserable about, and much to be concerned about, and much to be focusing on when it comes to trying to identify credible solutions. But I don't know which one of those you want to start with. I think in terms of just where we're going as an international community, I think the pandemic could be a little bit of a watershed in this respect, and the jury is still out as to whether the wash-up result of the pandemic is to be a wake-up call to the international community about the absolute necessity for international cooperation and collaboration in dealing with these transnational, global, regional public goods issues, or whether rather we will see the other side of the coin, a retreat into very defensive nationalism, focusing on worrying about supply chains and developing protectionist policies and all that goes with that, which can have quite serious longer-term economic implications, but also be more inwardly focused, much less willing to even think about Olof Palme's concept of common security, finding your security with others rather than against them. It's possible we'll go down that particular route. And some of the drum beating that's going on about China at the moment, including in my own country, is a depressing indication of the way in which, you know, we can get defensively neurotic about things rather than just work very, very hard at trying to find cooperative and collaborative solutions. But I'll leave it to you to pick up one or more of those threads and see where they take us.
Well, let's talk about nuclear weapons and the challenge posed by, you know, Boris Johnson's initiative to increase the nuclear stock of the British.
Yeah, well, despite the optimism that has been generated by the Nuclear Ban Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, with the support that it has had from the majority of UN member states, and the significance of that as a big step forward in the delegitimization of nuclear weapons, and the normative need to get an understanding of how indiscriminately inhumane and horrible they are, and why we must set our sights on ultimate elimination. But despite all that, I think we have to be honest with ourselves and acknowledge that global zero is about as far away as it has ever been, because there's no prospect whatsoever now and for the foreseeable future of any of the 9 nuclear armed states buying into that treaty, or indeed it getting support from any of the major allies, Australia included, of the United States, who believe, I think wrongly, that they're guaranteeing their security by sheltering under that protective umbrella. The truth of the matter, as we all know, is that those very, very important arms control agreements that have been negotiated over the last 2 or 3 decades are either dead or dying or on life support. We know that there's no enthusiasm from any of the nuclear armed states for moving seriously down the path of disarmament. We know that the Iran, obviously, JCPOA, the agreement there is in trouble, although the latest news is a little bit encouraging there, that the United States may be prepared to make some necessary compromises on sanctions to get back to some degree of sanity there. We know that we're having real difficulty in advancing the denuclearization of the North Korean peninsula, and generally the environment is pretty bleak. There's a couple of rays of mini sunlight on the horizon. The no first use concept, doctrinal commitment to never being the first to use nuclear weapons, is now very much back on the agenda. It's the subject of campaigning now from the Global Zero organization, Parliamentarians for Nuclear Non-Proliferation and Disarmament. And most importantly, there is some degree of optimism that with President Biden's election, there will be a move by the United States to embrace no first use, or at least its functional equivalent, a declaration that the sole purpose of nuclear weapons is to defend against nuclear attack. If we can go down that particular path and the United States can exercise some leadership in that respect, then I think we may begin to get a few things back on track. But it's going to be a very long, hard haul, and I'm afraid that the prospect of a nuclear holocaust is something that really, really, really does worry me. Not so much because I think it's likely that any country will deliberately, aggressively use nuclear weapons to advance either territorial claims or some political agenda. The greater risk to me for the foreseeable future is, I think, sort of accidental use through system error, human error, human idiocy, miscalculation, miscommunication, perhaps contributed to by cyber sabotage and everything that can go wrong with communication and understanding. And the way in which, in this kind of environment, where there's a lot of volatile things going on, small incidents can escalate quite dramatically and some serious miscalculations can be made. And we know from the Cold War years and all the archives that are being opened, even with all the very sophisticated command and control systems that the major nuclear powers had, we came incredibly close to nuclear catastrophe on maybe a dozen occasions over that period. And frankly, it's not statesmanship or it's not system integrity, it's sheer dumb luck that we avoided a nuclear holocaust over that period. And I think you'd be very brave indeed in the present environment to think that our luck can continue indefinitely. So the nuclear agenda is one that's very important to pursue, by getting it into the heads of the leaderships, top down, that they have to get serious about moving toward disarmament and the steps that are necessary to advance that. It's a matter for the peer groups, countries like Mexico, Australia, the middle powers, and maybe we'll talk about middle power diplomacy later on, to put pressure on, particularly United States allies, to say, look, we're quite happy with extended deterrence, but not extended nuclear deterrence. This is not a safety net at all. It's a recipe for disaster. But it also depends on, as every major reform movement does, it also depends on bottom-up activity, energizing, mobilizing civil society, key NGOs, to put that pressure on governments from below to take these issues seriously. So the nuclear agenda, on which Mexico has always been in the forefront, Australia has tried to be in the forefront, certainly under Labor governments, is an area on which we should be working very, very hard, I think, to build some renewed international momentum.
Yes, Professor Evans, I made an interview a few weeks ago to the Secretary General of the Organization for the Proscription of Nuclear Weapons in Latin America. And he reminded us all that when that agreement, that Tlatelolco Treaty to make Latin America nuclear weapon free zone was created, not all of the current members participated initially. So I mentioned this because there's some worries about this new treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons that has not been endorsed by nuclear major powers, but that doesn't mean that in the future nuclear powers may not join it. So I believe that we can try to be optimistic. I try to understand your concept of optimism, and I believe we can be optimistic by looking at previous experiences, such as the way the Tlatelolco Treaty evolved and the way that now we have all the Latin American countries involved and committed to it.
I think we do have to acknowledge that there are some difficulties with the banned treaty, not just the obvious ideological and psychological difficulties that these guys will have in giving up their testosterone-driven armaments, but also there are some technical issues. There is a real issue about verification, which might be solved over time, but there's a particular issue about enforcement, which frankly is not going to be soluble anytime soon. And the nuclear armed states are worried that if they give up their weapons and then there's a rogue state breakout, there'll be no international mechanism that will be effective to deal with that. And I think we have to acknowledge that. And realistically, I think those of us who are in the business of campaigning worldwide on the nuclear issue, while we should never for a second abandon the goal of ultimate elimination of global zero, I think it does make sense to put a lot of energy and resources into what we called in that commission that I co-chaired with my Japanese colleague, the minimization agenda. The elimination agenda must be there, but the immediate agenda is minimization, for which the key issues, I think, are what I call the 4 Ds. One is doctrine, no first use, which we've talked about, but there's also de-alerting, taking those huge number of weapons that are on basically hair trigger alert off that status to minimize the risk of nuclear exchange through miscalculation or accident. There's the D of deployment, reducing deployment. You might not destroy the stockpiles completely, but you can take an awful lot of those weapons that are presently out there on the front line away from the front line, put them in storage, so you build in some serious time frame before anyone rushes around pushing buttons. And then, of course, the remaining D is decrease numbers. If we can get the numbers down from the well over 13,000 nuclear weapons that now exist, with a destructive capacity of something like 100,000 Hiroshima-sized bombs, if we can reduce that number down to maybe a couple of thousand, then we will have made some progress. A world that has achieved those objectives, those 4 Ds, certainly won't be a perfect world, but it's arguably a hell of a lot safer and saner than the one we have at the moment. And it's not totally unimaginable that within a reasonable time frame we could achieve most of those objectives, but it will require an awful lot of political will from the people that matter most. It will require a lot of campaigning from all of us around the world who have some capacity at one level or another to exert some influence.
I believe it's a very positive issue the fact that disarmament is in the agenda, because I believe that after 9/11, disarmament almost disappeared in the international agenda. But thanks to the effort made by different countries, Australia, Mexico, of course, and NGOs that push very hard for the landmine, you know, the Ottawa Process Treaty, and then the Cluster Munition Treaty, and then the Nuclear Weapons Prohibition Treaty. I believe that disarmament is again on the agenda, and I believe that's very positive. Now, thinking about what you mentioned about Mexico being in the forefront of disarmament and Australia trying to be in the forefront, the two countries are considered middle powers. We can debate what a middle power is and what can a middle power achieve. But the thing is that they have resources, they have political resources, they have certain relevance in international politics and international affairs. And they have, for instance, worked together in different fora, such as APEC, for example, or more recently, MICTA. So my question is, from an Australian point of view, what role is for middle powers to be played in global governance these days?
Well, middle powers, I think, are very important. What we're talking about are countries that don't have either the military or the economic capability to impose their will on anybody, but nonetheless are sufficiently well-resourced, sufficiently diplomatically resourced, sufficiently credible, and sufficiently committed to working for a better world to actually make a difference when they engage in the traditional modus operandi of middle powers, which is coalition building of like-minded countries around particular issues. And the landmines campaign that you described, the cluster bombs campaign, are classic examples of this, as are a number of the efforts that have been made to build organizational coordination and so on. MICTA that you describe is one such example. I'm not sure how much grunt MICTA, will have. We've got some uncertain bedfellows there with Turkey joining Australia and Mexico, and Turkey's a little bit of a bust at the moment under the Erdogan administration. But nonetheless, the idea of middle powers being creative, energetic, and able to build these worldwide or region-wide coalitions of support for often unpopular causes is a pretty important international phenomenon. As I said a few moments ago, I mean, for any sort of big change to be made in international relations, or indeed perhaps anything else, you need things happening top down, sideways, from peer group pressure and sort of bottom up. And the middle powers are classic vehicles for sort of peer group pressure and building constituencies and building momentum, building normative momentum. Perhaps you don't always get all the runs that you want on the board, but it was a middle power coalition that produced the cluster bombs ban. It was a middle power coalition that did the other stuff that we've been talking about, it's just very important to keep that particular flame alive. Australian governments have waxed and waned in their enthusiasm for multilateral diplomacy generally, and middle power diplomacy in particular. But I think it's a very important part of the repertoire, and it's a very important element in the Australia-Mexico relationship, which I hope we can build on in future.
Yes, and speaking about that, speaking about middle powers, I would like to invite you to pose a question. The purpose of this question is that we are going to give the person who answers right this question a book on Australia and Canada foreign policies. That's a book I was working by the end of last century. That's the reason I met you, and I met different scholars and experts on Australian foreign issues. So this book is going to be for the person who answers the following question. And now Mr. Evans is going to make that question.
Well, the question we discussed, which I thought might challenge us and initiate a little bit of discussion later on when you know the answer, is who's the author of this quote which reads as follows: The United States has two choices about how we use the great and overwhelming military and economic power we now possess. We can try to use it to try to stay top dog on the global block in perpetuity, or we can use it to try to create a world in which we will be comfortable living when we are no longer top dog on the global block. Who said that?
Okay, that's a very good question. And well, now I know the answer. I was discussing this with Professor Evans prior to this interview, and
you didn't know the answer until I told you. You didn't know the answer.
Yes, I was surprised to know who said
was
that.
Wrong.
So,
anyway.
Yeah, okay.
We'll come
so
back
it's
to that.
a real challenge. We will wait for your answer, and then we will discuss the answer. So please try to answer this question. You have to send us an email to registrowebinar.ceop@gmail.com. You send your answer, and the answer that is correct will have this book, and we will discuss the answer. Now, while we wait for the answer, Professor Evans, now is 2021. It's been 20 years since R2P was announced, presented to the global community. And I believe that was a major keystone in dealing with the human security agenda. So what has happened in these 20 years, and what are the challenges and the achievements in your view?
Well, it's 15 years or 16 years since the report was removed from the bookshelves and actually given real life by being embraced universally by the General Assembly in 2005 at the World Summit. And you had the world's heads of state and government there, and they unanimously endorsed this concept that mass atrocity crimes, genocide, ethnic cleansing, other crimes against humanity, major war crimes were not nobody's business, but everyone's business. So what has happened in the 15 years, at least, since this was formally embraced? Well, quite a bit. And although part of the story is pretty gloomy, not all of the story is. I think there's 4 benchmarks that we can use to evaluate the success or otherwise of R2P. The first is, how successful has it been in establishing a new normative standard, in getting us away from this notion that things that happen behind high sovereign state borders were nobody else's business? I think it's been very successful in that respect, as demonstrated by the annual debates in the UN General Assembly, as demonstrated by the fact that on multiple occasions the concept has been invoked by the Security Council. Yes, there are a handful of spoilers, some still in your neighborhood, like Cuba and Nicaragua, I'm afraid to say, that continue to say that it's all a terrible, terrible idea. But overwhelmingly, people accept that this is a global responsibility. Second benchmark is, how successful has it been as a sort of catalyst for institutional change? And here again, I think we can chalk up a number of successes. Civilian preparedness to engage in responsive and preventive activity in these situations is much greater than it was. International cooperation through Friends of R2P, a secretariat of countries that are now 60 or more of them have established internal focal points where you've got someone whose day job it is to focus on these issues and to focus on energizing an appropriate national response when they come to light. You've got much greater military preparedness to deal with those situations where a military intervention may be authorized by the Security Council. And, you know, doctrine and rules of engagement and training and all the rest of it is much better advanced to deal with these kinds of situations. Third benchmark is, how successful has it been as a preventive enterprise? Well, of course, the trick about prevention is that when it succeeds, nothing happens, therefore nobody notices, and preventive activity, as we all know, with conflict prevention, can be pretty frustrating business, and persuading funders that you've done something, if you're an organization devoted to conflict prevention, can be quite tricky. But here I think R2P has served its purpose quite well. There are many examples I could quote around the world, and Africa in particular, where R2P has been invoked and diplomatic effort has been mobilized under the banner of R2P to stop very volatile situations, cascading, over the edge, the volcano erupting. Just one example to make the point: Burundi in Central Africa, with exactly the same demographics as the Rwanda next door, which we can all remember, the horror of the genocide there, has been on the point of exploding probably half a dozen times over the last 15 years. But on each occasion, the African Union, the United Nations, has mobilized diplomatic effort, engagement, and pulled that country back from the edge of the volcano. So preventively, we haven't done a bad job. But reactively, what's the story when prevention has failed, atrocity crimes are occurring? Well, we haven't had too many successes there, frankly. A few, Kenya earlier on, is a pretty clear example. Libya initially in 2011, when the Security Council did agree on a military intervention, when terrible one-sided violence was being perpetrated by the Gaddafi regime. But that went sour when the Security Council failed to maintain consensus about maintaining that military engagement. The P3, the UK, the US, and France wanted to go hell for leather for regime change. The rest of the world said, no, this is about civilian protection, not regime change. And that led into the catastrophe of the failure of any kind of response, invoking R2P with Syria, which plunged from one-sided violence into catastrophic civil war as a result. And we've seen further problems in Sri Lanka since, and we've seen it now twice in Myanmar with the Rohingya assault in 2017, and now with the military's assault on the entire population. So, we haven't been as good as we should have been in reacting, not so much with military response, because that's always going to be a very hard call, but naming and shaming, arms embargoes, diplomatic isolation, sanctions, threats and implementation of prosecution through the International Criminal Court. These are all tools that are available, and they haven't been sufficiently utilised. So there's a big job still ahead to give effective implementation to R2P, but it's a concept that has caught the imagination of many people. I can't tell you how many PhD students there are around the world. I can't tell you how many political science courses and public affairs courses talk about R2P, and how many messages I get from youngsters around the world who are energized and engaged by this idea. So again, I am an incorrigible optimist that over the long haul we can get back to something approaching a greater degree of consensus on the Security Council and elsewhere around that. But we've still got a long way to go.
Yes, I believe there's much to be done. I was remembering Romeo Dallaire. Remember Romeo Dallaire, who was in charge of a small peacekeeping operation prior to the Rwanda genocide. Yeah. He's been developing this concept about the will to intervene. What do you think about that?
Well, Romeo Dallaire is one of my heroes, for the effort that he made and the shocking sort of psychological trauma that he went through when those efforts were unsuccessful. And what he's about is just energizing that degree of engagement, commitment, reminding us all of our common humanity and the absolute necessity to respect that by not turning our backs when atrocity crimes are being perpetrated, even if it's wholly within the boundaries of a sovereign state. It's one of the organizations that is working, there's a number of them around the world, to just energize and give practical weight and effect to that commitment, and constantly remind governments that they can't shelter behind indifference or lack of knowledge or pretense that this is not a universally accepted norm now. What we've got to do is put flesh and blood on that norm.
Yes, I agree. Now, I would like your views on the following. We have witnessed in recent years a number of crises such as the war in Syria, or the situation in Ukraine when Russia, took over Crimea. And all these crises have not reached the United Nations Security Council, or they have reached the UN Security Council, but the Security Council has been paralyzed. This reminds me of the Cold War times, when the Security Council couldn't do anything when a crisis erupted. So this is of concern, because these crises are being arranged or managed by other actors, not the UN. What's your take on that? Are we witnessing a crisis on conflict management by the UN?
Yeah, it's a very depressing sort of environment. All that hopes that we all had with the early post-Cold War years, when the atmosphere on the Security Council was completely different, when there was genuine cooperation, when even though China was a reluctant enthusiast for some of these things, it was never exercising a veto. It was just abstaining from all the difficult things. But now you've got Russia being a systematic spoiler in just about every international context, and behaving very badly locally. And with that veto power that it has, it alone can stop any kind of consensus emerging on all these key issues. The composition of the Security Council is a problem, as Latin Americans are well aware, because you're not represented there. It is the world of the middle of the last century, not the world of the 21st century that is represented. Unfortunately, I think even if we were to change, and it's been one of my crusades over many years to try to make the Security Council more representative of the current world, were it to be so, and were its numbers to be expanded and to include, countries as it should, like India and so on, I won't get into the debate about which Latin American country it should be. If it were, I mean, I don't think we could assume that the environment would be any better about the exercise of the ability to find consensus. It's a troubling environment. So it is the case that if we are going to make progress on a lot of these big issues, the big existential issues we began by talking about, or so many of the other conflict situations around the world, it is, I think, for the foreseeable future, going to have to be through other mechanisms, little plurilateral efforts like the negotiation of the Iran nuclear deal. It's going to be bilateral or small-scale regional efforts, as in North Korea, the denuclearization of the peninsula there. I think that's the reality, and with middle powers exercising such pressure as they can, and actively motivated major powers. But in many ways, it's not just the Russias and Chinas that we should be critical of, because I've given one example already of the US, UK and France completely losing the plot over the Libyan intervention. They won clear Security Council support for a civilian protection exercise when it looked like a major massacre was about to occur, with Gaddafi forces moving on Benghazi. But then they couldn't help themselves but to adopt a regime change agenda, refused to listen to any of the BRICS countries. Brazil was on the Security Council at that stage, as was India, as was South Africa, as well as China and Russia. And those BRICS countries were a very important bloc, and they had supported the initial intervention. But when the P3 behaved as they did, that was the end of any consensus, and that was a watershed in history if we look back, and that's been the big thing that inhibited any kind of consensus at all on how to deal with Syria. And the scars of that little exchange in 2011 are still seriously borne. So there's no easy way out of this, except to use such mechanisms as we can. I think we've got to place a lot of emphasis on sort of the dialogue machinery that is evolving in various places around the world at a regional or sub-regional level. You know better than I do the art of the possible in Latin America in this respect. In Asia, the East Asian Summit, as we call it, does exist as a gathering annually at head of head of government level of every key country in the region, with an open-ended both economic and security agenda. And that does create an environment in which heads of government, heads of state can get together and work at finding collaborative solutions to these great issues. And maybe we're just going to have to inch our way forward using such mechanisms as are available and such pressures as we can mobilize in particular cases. But it's we've got a long way to go to recreate an environment in which we can be really comfortable that we're going to solve these problems. But don't give up on the UN. Is a very, very multilateral engagement. All the huge family of organisations that operate under the UN umbrella are incredibly important in advancing so many of our policy agendas, and most of them are working, frankly, pretty well. We're seeing real problems at the top. Every now and again, problems arise. WHO organisation, WTO problems, and so on and so forth. But by and large, I mean, if we're going to be serious about cooperative and collaborative solutions to these big public goods problems, we are going to have to work seriously with these global organizations, and with adults back in charge now in Washington at last, after the horror of the Trump administration.
Yes.
we can have a lot more confidence that these organizations will continue to operate effectively. Have we got an answer to our question yet? Has anyone given us an answer?
No, I was thinking that most of the structure of the UN works very good, but because they do good and they're working well, they don't attract the media or the attention it deserves. It's only when things go wrong that you get the attention of the media, and normally this leads us to address the UN Security Council. It is paralyzed, etc. But the other institutions are working well, so I agree. And the reason I ask you this question is because, as I'm sure you know, Mexico is now a non-permanent member of the UN. And well, in the morning I was talking to people in our mission to the UN, and they were telling me that today they will be discussing the reform of the UN Security Council. So I thought to myself, oh, this is hard.
It's hard. It's hard.
But we shouldn't give up. I agree with you. Well, let me tell you, Professor, that we have a winner. The winner is Alejandro Perez, and he replied correctly. He said that it's Bill Clinton who said that. So it's great. Do you want to make a comment on that? Because remember what I told you. I told you that I thought it was Donald Trump who said that. So please.
Not Donald Trump. No, it was an extraordinary quote, and I'll repeat the essence of it again. US has got two great choices about how we use our power: to try to stay top dog on the global bloc in perpetuity, or rather to create a world in which we are comfortable living when we're no longer top dog on the global bloc. And clearly Clinton's preference was for the latter, and I thought that was just a pitch perfect statement. The interest of this quote is that he never made it publicly, and no American president has said anything that specific publicly since. Where I heard Clinton, I was on a platform with him in California, Los Angeles. It's a whole different story. It was a Hollywood event. Crazy. But there it was. I heard Clinton say this, and he meant it. And he said something a little bit like it publicly at Yale a couple of years later. This is after he left the presidency. This is in 2002, when he was a private citizen. But no American leader is going to, even now, I think, be heard to say that we should abandon our aspirations for global leadership, for primacy, predominance, preeminence. They might agree with it privately. They might agree that the tectonic plates have changed, that China is right up there now alongside them, and that the task is working out how to live comfortably with this environment in which global leadership is shared rather than unequivocally unipolar. But they're not going to say it, and therein lies an issue, I think, for all of us, because when the Americans are behaving in a sort of a triumphalist way, or a way that's over assertive, and insensitive to the realities of other power pressures that are at work, then that way lies a lot of problems and a lot of tensions and a lot of difficulty. And I think we're in that condition at the moment. I think the adults are back in charge in Washington. People who would share that perception of Clinton's are back in charge. But are they going to say it? And if they don't say it, is that just going to feed into the stereotype perception that America hasn't learned anything and is going to go on being sort of over assertive and over dominant and insufficiently attentive to the need to accommodate new realities and to work cooperatively? So we're at a little bit of a testing point, which is why I thought the quote was an interesting one, because it does encapsulate the issues in a very stark way.
Yeah, and it looks like today, the debate we're having today. And in your view, that's also part of my perception, but I would like to know your views. I believe that the Donald Trump administration compromised the leadership of the US. In your view, Biden will be able to bring back in track the US or not? What do you think?
I think there's every chance that over time that he will. I mean, that inherent decency, that inherent moderation, that inherent understanding of the need for multilateral cooperation is all fantastically important. And I think most of the people around him share that mindset, and it's it's very, very refreshing. Certainly his I know he's got some problems still with the Mexico border, as you're acutely aware, and that's not helping his popularity domestically at the moment, that particular very emotive issue. But he is systematically addressing an awful lot of the other things that were careering off the rails with Trump. I mean, climate change most obviously, and using climate as a vehicle to find at least one area of cooperative collaboration with China in an environment which is otherwise very tense. I mean, I think that's just incredibly good thinking. Right. He is now, treating allies as assets rather than encumbrances, which was the Trump sort of view of the world. He is showing respect, as I said, for multilateral institutions and processes generally. And I think, look, America has sacrificed a gigantic chunk of its soft power, its persuasive credibility. The condition of American democracy is still extremely fragile. I'm not just talking about assaults on the Congress. I'm talking about the flagrant gerrymandering and the money politics and everything else. I mean, America is not a model country in terms of its governance at the moment internally. And there's only, I'm sure Biden and his administration will do everything they can to restore the credibility of American democracy. But frankly, there's a very long way to go, and it's no longer the light on the hill for many other countries in terms of that. So yeah, look, I think we should be confident. What matters in government is, above all, sort of integrity, above all decency, above all respect for our common humanity. And you've got all those things, I think, very, very visible at the top in the present US administration. So I think we should be very grateful. But God, it's volatile, and you can see from the way that level of Republican support for Trump is holding up to absolutely unbelievable levels. 70% plus of Republicans still support Trump and everything that he stood for. And, given the peculiar character of the American democratic system, I mean, it's not impossible that Trump himself or a Trump clone could reappear in 3 years' time for the next US election. So, our confidence, our optimism has to be tempered by that particular reality. But for the moment, so far, so good.
Yes, it's interesting to me that every time I discuss these issues with diplomats, politicians in Mexico and abroad, they always use the word decency when they refer to Biden. And that's very symptomatic because I think Donald Trump was a catastrophe. But sadly, as you mentioned, there is Trumpism without Trump in the States, and he may come back, and he's preparing his return to politics, and that's worrisome, of course. Yeah. Well, we have now questions from the audience. I will read it for you. Professor Evans, what would you respond to the critics of R2P who claim this principle has a tendency to only apply to underdeveloped countries, while we cannot pretend humanitarian crises never happen in developed countries?
Well, it certainly is applicable to every country in the world alike. The principles are there, and there's no possible argument about that. It so happens that some of the situations that have been most explosive have been in developing countries, Africa in particular, and that some of the remedial measures that have been effectively taken with the International Criminal Court and through the application of effective diplomacy, have been in those countries. But I don't think there's any issue of principle involved here. I mean, one of the problems of R2P is that we have to face the reality that when horrific atrocity crimes occur within the boundaries of really major powers, whether it's China in the case of Xinjiang or Tibet, or whether, frankly, it's Russia in the case of Ukraine and so on, or whether it's were to happen in the United States, it's very difficult to mobilize the R2P remedies. I mean, the military remedy clearly is just not credible, not only because of the vetoes that would be exercised in the Security Council, but because of the prudential reality that initiating military action to save lives at risk of atrocity crimes would, in these circumstances, unquestionably precipitate a full-scale war, which would add immeasurably to the scale of the human tragedy. So you've always got to apply the principle of doing more good than harm with your remedies, and that's an inherent limitation on R2P, not in principle but in practice. So, but the notion that it's somehow inapplicable, that it'll never be applied to any Western power, I think is just wrong. I mean, there's a lot of pressure on Israel, of course, in the context of what it's up to in Palestine, and a highly developed country, not a major country, but a highly developed one, behaving very, very badly. And I think the eyes of the world are increasingly on that. So don't assume that this is just a weapon for use in the most poverty-stricken or unpowerful of developing countries. It's a universal weapon, and we have to apply it as such.
Okay. Yes. We have another question. What's your view about Biden's insistence on the Armenian genocide and relations with Turkey?
Well, I think this was wildly overdue, the recognition of the Armenian genocide for what it was. This was unquestionably, before the word was invented, but this was unquestionably one of the major genocides of the 21st century, and it's been so regarded by every objective analysis of the issues. Acknowledge this because of its anxiety to keep Turkey in the NATO fold and to not rock the Turkish boat. But Erdogan now is behaving so badly that I think that inhibition is less strong than it used to be. There's still a desire to keep Turkey part of the Western sort of military alliance, but even that is becoming harder to sustain as Turkey snuggles up to its long-time enemy Russia and finds common ground in their common enthusiasm for dictatorship. So I think just to call the Armenian genocide as it was was absolutely the right call, and even though it's clearly going to make life a bit more complicated with Turkey, I don't think we should overstate that. I mean, there are many people. I mean, I know the Islamist sentiment is growing in Turkey, as distinct from the great secular traditions of that country, and this is causing some complications. But there is within the country a huge store of decency and recognition of the reality of Turkey's very bad behaviour in the past. And from time to time there have been academic commissions and so on proposed, with serious scholars wanting to articulate the issues and lay them out once and for all. Right. So I think we can overstate the extent to which this is an emotive issue. It's an emotive issue for successive Turkish governments, but whether it is such for the population at large, I doubt that it's an emotive issue on that scale. I mean, ordinary people are pretty decent, and they are prepared to acknowledge when they understand and are knowledgeable about the facts. They are prepared to acknowledge fault, particularly in the past. I mean, Australia's had to do that with our treatment of our own Indigenous people. We got a lot of well-deserved praise, I think, for the apologies that we made, for the slaughters and the mistreatment that we have perpetrated in the past. And that was a very long time coming, that apology. And there were many people inside the country that didn't want to acknowledge that and said it's none of our business, that was the past. But overwhelmingly, the country was behind the political leaders when they made those statements. And cultures do change, understanding of these issues changes over time. So again, I'm reasonably optimistic about the longer run in Turkey, but this is a very, very difficult government we have there at the moment. And it's one of those authoritarian governments that you worry about post-COVID. Will the Turkeys and the Hungaries of this world be the new normal, or will we go back to Biden-style decency? And it's on a pivot at the moment. And some good countries let you down. I mean, you began by talking about Boris Johnson's crazy decision for the UK to acquire new stockpiles of nuclear weapons, when everybody had frankly thought that the UK was a potential global leader in a serious disarmament cause. It was done without any internal process, it seems, and shocked a lot of people internally. But so leaders are constantly capable of doing crazy things or indefensible things, but keep our faith in the ordinary people.
Okay. Well, we're approaching the end of the interview, but we have one question in Facebook, and I have one question for you. So let me quickly pose a question via Facebook. The question is, what is your point of view on cyber-activism to denounce nuclear tests, weapon uses, and military violence?
I'm totally in favor of bottom-up, energizing action by civil society groups seeking to mobilize, wider population. With 21 years in politics, was it interesting to appreciate the extent to which parliamentarians reacted to quite small campaigns if they were producing messages and phone calls to their officers saying, you've got to take this issue seriously, you've got to do this. It would only take, maybe a dozen of those sort of messages for my fellow politicians to come to me and say, hey, there's a real community sentiment about this. Can we go on ignoring this issue? What should we be doing about it? So never underestimate the power of that sort of pressure from below. I mean, ordinary people sometimes feel a sense of complete futility, complete hopelessness. I don't have a voice. I'm not inside the room. I don't have any influence, any power. What can I possibly do? Well, what you can do is join these civil society organizations or join in these campaigns, write the letters, make the phone calls, send the messages, use the social media, just to generate a sense that, people care care about a particular issue. Not usually going to be enough by itself. You're going to need those other levels of pressure and understanding and commitment. But it's, I think it's not a sufficient condition, but it's a necessary condition for effective reform.
Okay. And then the final question.
Okay.
You are a professor and you work with students, and we have many students here following this interview. And many of them are students of international relations. So my question is, what do you think, what would you say to students of international relations? And what would you say to them in terms of improving or skills that they should develop or things they should be looking at this point?
Well, I've written about this, and there's an article on my website which you might look up. So you want to be a diplomat, it's called, and that's a set of suggestions for anybody wanting an international career, not just in a foreign office. I think, you know, in terms of, you know, first of all, you've got to obviously do well in your studies and have a very solid intellectual foundation. Don't get too obsessed about formal study of international relations as such, in particular international relations theory, which I have to say I never ever took very seriously, and it didn't make a ha'porth of difference to my own role as foreign minister. And a lot of it's crazily abstract and irrelevant, but the policy focused studies that you do, the history studies that you do, are incredibly important. It doesn't necessarily, I mean, what people in international affairs often, their backgrounds are not necessarily international relations at all. There are other disciplines, but you've got to have strong academic, intellectual background and capacity. You need to advance other skills. Language skills are incredibly important. I'm afraid I'm pretty monolingual. I'm not a good example of this. As someone once said, you know, I think it was Ernest Bevan, a UK foreign minister, the only job I could have in the foreign affairs establishment as minister, because I wouldn't get a job at any other level because of my language skill. But that's incredibly important in the contemporary world. I mean, English might be the lingua franca, and that's a necessary condition to have it. But you know, the level of cultural understanding and sensitivity that comes with any language study is incredibly important. You've got to maximise your experience. I mean, do internships as much as you possibly, if you want an international career, with organisations. And International Crisis Group, when I was running it, we took 90 to 100 interns a year from all around the world, the best and the brightest. And we couldn't guarantee them all jobs, but when those entry-level jobs did come up, they invariably went to young people that we knew. We'd seen their capacity by working with us. And what you've also got to do is just have a bit of luck. You know, with any career, you can position yourself with the skills that you acquire, the experience you acquire, but you know, find yourself missing out on the jobs that you want over and over again, and not necessarily with any great objective justice. So just recognise that, have other irons in the fire, have other career options very much in mind, so that you're not going to be totally devastated if you don't realise your primary dream. But it really, I mean, for the world to get out of some of the the dilemmas it's currently in, the fragility that it's currently in, the next generation's role in this is going to be fantastically important. It's not all greybeards like me. We've had our time, and we've come and we're going. It's the next generation that really would matter. And just for the next generation to abandon that sense of public policy commitment and to rush off and want to make money in the finance sector and not go through the stress of an NGO career, the financial stress, or a public service career, which is not necessarily going to be all that remunerative. Just do recognise that these careers are fantastically important for our security, for our prosperity as a world. And if you do have that instinct that you want to make a contribution in international relations, please give that instinct free rein. The one other thing the advice I always give, which is very, very difficult now in this COVID period, is travel. Expose yourself, get that sense of what other cultures, other countries are like. I traveled enormously as a young student, and if anyone reads my memoir, Incorrigible Optimist, they'll see how often I refer to those travel experiences in Southeast Asia and Africa and the Middle East as just being incredibly formative for me in generating an understanding of other countries, other cultures, and taking us out of our little bubbles in which we live in our own country. Much harder with COVID. Travel effectively wound up, but that for youngsters wanting a career in this area, just maximize that kind of personal experience along with all the other things that I've described.
May I add to what Professor Evans just said, that you need to work on food for the spirit. Traveling is food for the spirit. And I didn't mention this when I introduced Professor Evans, but he has leisure interests such as reading, writing, travel, architecture, opera, golf, and Australian rules football. And that's amazing. I remember when I met with Bruce Grant, I was amazed at the fact that he's a very well-known film critic, and I was amazed at that. And he's, of course, a key figure when we think about Australian foreign policy. So think about, what Professor Gareth Evans just said, but also you need to feed your spirit, and you need to diverse your interests, because
absolutely
everything you learn in life is useful. That's what I have learned in my life, so I share that with you. So, Professor Evans, it's been an enormous pleasure to have you here with us today. There's a number of issues we would like to discuss with you, but time is running out. But I hope we can meet sometime in the near future to do that. I thank you again. I wish that we sort this pandemic out and we can meet again in Buenos Aires. The last time I met with you was in Buenos Aires, remember, yes, during a seminar on nuclear non-proliferation, or in Australia or in Mexico. So thank you very much. I don't know if you want to make a final statement.
Well, just thank you so much, María Cristina. Thank you for all the colleagues for listening in, colleagues and friends, and every best wish for the Olof Palme Center. And may that spirit of Olof Palme and that spirit of finding your security with others rather than against them, may that be the one that prevails. And every best wish to you, your organization, your colleagues, and that army of youngsters out there that really are capable and able to make this world of ours a safer and saner place. So good luck with your careers, all of you. And thanks so much again, María Cristina, for hosting me. It's been a great pleasure.
Thank you very much, Professor Gareth Evans. Wish you the best. Have a great day. And thank you all. Next week, I want to tell you that we will be interviewing former President of the Dominican Republic, Leonel Fernandez. So stay tuned. Give us a like in our social network. And see you soon. Thank you.